All right, we are going to be in the book of Numbers. And it's going to be chapter 12. Numbers chapter 12. We covered last week the story of Aaron and the golden calf. The mistake that Aaron made as Moses, what they called delayed, or as he was up on the mountain for 40 days. The impatience of the people, they come to Aaron with a request to make an idol, to make an image that can lead them. Aaron obliges. And yet when Aaron was confronted with that by Moses, Aaron was quite quick in shielding himself from any of the blame. All right, there were a couple of ways that evidenced itself. First, he didn't want to take personal responsibility. He let Moses know, the heart of the people is set on mischief. You know how these people are. And then, of course, to say that I put the gold in and out came this idol, was just really silly, just an obnoxious way to try to avert any kind of responsibility. And Aaron was in trouble. And we learned from the verses in Deuteronomy that Moses recounts how I had to pray for Aaron. I had to pray for Aaron because God was going to destroy him. Of course, God was going to destroy the entire nation and start over with Moses, and yet he interceded for them. But we looked at that passage and that story as being paramount in the big mess up, the biggest mess up that we know that Aaron committed. When we come over to Numbers chapter 12, we're going to look at a passage and we're going to see how Aaron, even in a mistake that he makes, handles it a lot better this time and shows that Aaron has indeed learned about confession, about intercession, and the power of those things. So let's read Numbers chapter 12, and then we'll go back through with some comments on it. Numbers chapter 12, it says that Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said, Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it. And now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. And the Lord spake suddenly unto Moses and unto Aaron and unto Miriam, Come out, ye three, unto the tabernacle of the congregation. And they three came out. And the Lord came down in the pillar of the cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. And he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. And the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Wherefore then were ye not afraid to speak against Moses my servant? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. And the cloud departed from off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said unto Moses, Alas, my Lord, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly, and wherein we have sinned. Let her not be as one dead, of whom the flesh is half consumed, when he cometh out of his mother's womb. And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, Heal her now, O God, I beseech thee. And the Lord said unto Moses, If her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed 7 days? Let her be shut out of the camp 7 days, and after that let her be received in again. And Miriam was shut out from the camp 7 days, and the people journeyed not till Miriam was brought in again. So let's cover this passage. We'll see the mistake that they made, of course, but Aaron certainly responds in a much more appropriate way when confronted this time. Okay, number one, let's talk about these family frustrations here from the first couple of verses. It says there in verse number 1 that Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. Now, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of information on this. In fact, you read the rest of verse 1, it says, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. Really doesn't give us a lot of detail. It's kind of left a lot of folks to speculate on what this could have been. Is it a reference? We know that when Moses was on the run for 40 years after he had left Egypt, he marries Zipporah, the son or the daughter of Jethro, the daughter of the priest of Midian. And yet that was a number of years ago. Most people look at this passage and think that, decades later, are they speaking out against Moses for whom he married? And that kind of leaves some conflict there as to what has actually happened. Has Moses gotten remarried? Has Moses' first wife passed? Has he married another woman here? Is this a second wife that Moses has taken? And the Bible doesn't fill in all of that information. All we know is that this is the pretext for Aaron and Miriam beginning to speak against him. Now, why would they speak against him for the wife that he married? Is it has Moses' home led to conflict in leadership with the children of Israel? Apparently, according to verse number 2, it tells us that they said, "Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us?" MacDonald notes that verse 1 really is the pretext. Verse 2 is the problem that they have. Verse 2 is the problem that Miriam and Aaron have. Now, it's veiled and it's shielded, and the pretext is that, this started because Moses married an Ethiopian woman. But though the Bible doesn't give us a lot of information on what happened, it certainly appears that Aaron and Miriam feel slighted in some kind of way. Have they been cut out of some decisions that were being made? Has Moses taken things from his home life and the wife that he has married and allowed that to impact or affect the decisions that he's making? We don't know the answer to all of that. But apparently, Aaron and Miriam feel slighted in some kind of way. Moses, in using his authority, has either bypassed them, not included them, done something that was not to their liking, or they feel slighted in some way where their response is, God speaks to us too. God didn't just speak to Moses. And the verse 1 tells us there that what they were saying was against Moses. So they're unhappy, they're embittered, they're murmuring. And the Bible warns us about that, cautions us to do things without murmuring and without complaining. And yet, whatever has happened, and the Scripture doesn't tell us what exactly led to this. You read from verse 2, they're unhappy. The pretext that they shield it with is that, Moses has married an Ethiopian woman. But verse 2 is the cause. They are unhappy. And so they are speaking against Moses. God speaks to us too. Not just you, Moses. God doesn't just speak to Moses. He speaks to us too. Now, verse 3 tells us that the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. Now, what they said, it says they spoke against Moses. Now, did they say these things to Moses? Did Moses even hear these things? Moses, in verse number 3, we're told, is probably not going to think that much of it anyway. This would certainly not be the first time that Moses has been spoken against. It's not the first time that maybe a decision that he's made or a pursuit that he has gone after. It's not going to be the first time that it's made someone unhappy. It's not going to be the first time that someone has questioned Moses' leadership. He's a very meek man. Moses is not the kind to feel slighted or to feel, to take every aggravation personally, to feel threatened, to feel the need for vengeance. That is not, that's not the guy Moses, okay? This is not just, Moses is not just giving himself a pat on the back here, right? I'm the meekest man that's on the face of the earth. This is inferring to us that whatever they had been saying probably just rolls off of Moses, right? Water off a duck's back. He's not going to think too much of it. It's his brother and sister anyway. It's probably to him not that big a deal, probably something that he would have passed over. But the end of verse number 2 gives you the real important fix, because it says at the end of verse 2 that the Lord heard it. So you put these first 3 verses together. Aaron and Miriam are unhappy. They have spoken out in some way against Moses, whether it was to him or about him. Moses, whatever. He's meek. He doesn't take it to heart. Not going to take it to heart. It's not going to be a huge deal. Probably a huge issue with Moses. Probably something that he would pass over and let go. But the Lord heard it. Okay? The Lord heard it. They had spoken out against the one that he had given leadership to. So beginning in verse number 4, the second thought here is how the Lord responds. We see the Lord's response beginning in verse number 4. It says that the Lord spake suddenly unto Moses and unto Aaron and unto Miriam, Come out ye 3 unto the tabernacle of the congregation. And they 3 came out. And the Lord came down in the pillar of the cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. So here the Lord calls all 3 of them, calls them to the door of the tabernacle, or calls them to the tabernacle, and then shows and manifests his visible presence, right? The pillar of cloud, that was what led the children of Israel by day. When it rested, when it ceased to move, the children of Israel would set up the tabernacle, and they would be there until the pillar of cloud moved again, or until the pillar of fire by night, whatever it may have been. This was a visible manifestation of the Lord's presence. It led them. When it stopped, they stopped. And they built the tabernacle around it, and the Lord speaks and tells Aaron and Miriam directly to come here. And it tells us at the end of verse number 5, they both come. And it says in verse 6 that he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known unto him in a vision and will speak unto him in a dream. God, when they say God has spoken unto us too, not just Moses, God speaks to us too, the Lord reminds them and tells them, absolutely, I do speak to my prophets. I do speak to my men. And I do speak to those that I want to relay my word. He does that in various ways, through visions, through dreams are mentioned here in verse number 6. We read in Hebrews chapter 1 how at divers times and in sundry manners God spake unto us, God spake unto the fathers by the prophets. He did so in various ways. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah were known, books that are known for their visions, the things that these prophets see by vision. We know about Joseph and Daniel and the dreams that they have, and God often spoke to his people in way of dreams. This is not unusual, and the Lord reminds Aaron and Miriam that, yeah, you're right, absolutely. I do speak to my prophets. I do show them visions. I do show them dreams. And yet, verse number 7, my servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. When God tells them in verse 6 that he often reveals his word to his prophets by means of visions, by means of dreams, he also lets them know, but it's not like that with Moses. That is not how he speaks to Moses. Now, he reminds them that Moses, above all, has shown himself to be faithful in all mine house. Moses has shown an unmatched faithfulness. Okay? We already know, according to this text, that he's meek, he's humble, he's the meekest man that was on the face of the earth. And even being meek, he has shown an unmatched faithfulness and dedication. His meekness was not a weakness of character, okay? Don't think of the word meek as being, soft or weak in character. Moses has shown himself to be ultimately faithful. He's shown himself faithful, according to verse 7, in all mine house. This is a faithfulness that would later be attested in future generations. Look in the book of Hebrews. We will turn to this one, Hebrews chapter 3. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse number 1. Hebrews 3 verse 1, it says, "Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him that appointed him." And who's the analogy? Who's the comparison when it talks about the faithfulness of Christ? "As also Moses was faithful in all his house." The same language that was used in Numbers chapter 12. "For this man was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who hath builded the house hath more honor than the house. For every house is builded by some man, but he that built all things is God. And Moses verily was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. But Christ as a son over his own house, whose house are we, if we hold fast with confidence, or hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm unto the end." The faithfulness of Moses is used as an analogy to the faithfulness of Christ. There is something peculiar about Moses. Now, obviously, he mentions that Christ is infinitely worthy of more glory than Moses. Moses was faithful in all of God's house, right? But no matter how great the servant is, the son is worthy of more glory in the house than the servant is. No matter how good the servant is, you don't compare the son to the servant. And yet, so Jesus Christ is infinitely more glorious than Moses. And yet he is the one that when you want to talk about the faithfulness of Christ, you would speak of Moses. You would speak of one who was faithful in all of God's house. There is something peculiar about Moses. And I get it, this is a study more about Aaron, and we would take more time to develop those ideas if it was a study about Moses. But there's something that's different about the prophet Moses. There's something about his faith. There's something different about him. There's something different about Moses as the revelator of the Old Covenant. That even the New Testament, of course, the New Testament Christians use Moses as an analogy. It certainly helps that Moses was the one, when they speak of a prophet, they speak of the prophet like unto Moses. And that was, of course, the Messiah who would come. But God reminds Aaron and Miriam, I give my prophets visions, dreams. I obviously might reveal my word to them in different ways. Moses is different. God tells Aaron and Miriam, Moses is different. Verse 7, my servant Moses is not so. Verse 8 says, with him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, not in dark speeches, and the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. There was a directness in God speaking to Moses. Much of the word that came to Moses did not come by means of a vision. It did not come through dreams. It did not come in the ways that the word often came to prophets in the Old Testament. God says, I speak to him directly. It says, I speak with him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently. He says that not in dark speeches. When God spoke to Moses, he didn't use analogies, and he didn't use proverbs, and he didn't use those things. He didn't veil anything. He spoke to him. He spoke to him openly. Thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not. When God spoke to Moses, he spoke directly, he spoke clearly, he veiled nothing, he left nothing up to imagination or to interpretation. He spoke directly to Moses. When Aaron and Miriam said, God speaks to Moses, but God speaks to us too, God reminds them, don't even think that this is the same thing. Don't even think that the way that God spoke to prophets in general is the same way in which he has been speaking to Moses. God has been speaking to Moses directly. There has been no question. There has been no way of denying. Moses is the man that God has appointed. Moses is the man to whom God has revealed his word and is revealing this covenant. He says at the end of verse 8, "Wherefore then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Why? You say that I speak to you all. I speak to Moses, I speak to Aaron, I speak to Miriam. It's obviously different with Moses. Why did you not see that? How could you not tell that it's different with Moses and the rest of you? Wherefore, or why then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? They appear to take this lightly. They appear to think God speaks to all of us. God speaks to Moses, but he speaks to us too. And God reminds them, this is not entirely the same at all. And you should have seen that. You should have seen the difference in the way that I speak to Moses and the way that I speak to the rest of you. And you should not have so lightly spoken against him. In verse number 9, it says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. They had taken his word and they had taken his prophet and they had dealt with him lightly. And he confronts them with it. Why were you so quick, or why were you not afraid to speak against my servant? And it says that his anger was kindled against them and he departed. God doesn't even wait around for them to respond. Aaron and Miriam aren't even given any opportunity to respond to the question here. Now, we don't even know all that they said. We don't even know the exact thing that caused them to feel slighted. We don't even know the exact cause that led them to feel upset. And yet they have downplayed the special place of Moses. They have downplayed and taken lightly the difference in Moses. And it's kindled the anger of the Lord there. So it says he departs, and in verse 10, the cloud departed from off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. Now, in this passage, Miriam is struck with leprosy. We don't have to go into all the details. You've read studies, you've done studies, we've talked about it before, leprosy. But what is interesting is that it mentions that she becomes leprous, white as snow, but don't discount the end of verse 10, because it says, and Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. Now, that's double information, right? The Bible already told us that in the first half of the verse. Miriam became leprous and white as snow. Why does it repeat the same information? Well, just read it again at the end of verse 10. Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because once Aaron, as high priest, beholds and sees that Miriam is leprous, this starts a cycle of responsibility for Aaron. Now, we're not going to read everything that's there, but let's turn to Leviticus chapter 13. There's a bunch in this chapter about leprosy. These are the laws concerning leprosy. And then chapter 14 will deal more with the cleansing of a leper. But notice, let's just read a few verses. Leviticus chapter 13. Verse number 1, it says, And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, When a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a rising, a scab, or bright spot, and it be in the skin of his flesh like the plague of leprosy, then he shall be brought unto Aaron the priest, or unto one of his sons the priest. And the priest shall look on the plague in the skin of the flesh, and when the hair in the plague is turned white, and the plague in the skin and in sight be deeper than the skin of his flesh. It is a plague of leprosy, and the priest shall look on him and pronounce him unclean. Now remember that. Once Aaron sees it, once Aaron as priest sees and diagnoses the leprosy in someone, he has a responsibility. What is that? That is to declare someone unclean. It also tells us in this same passage, if you'll jump down a few verses, I hate to cut out too much, but we'll do it. Verse 44, let's just start there. Verse 44 says, he's a leprous man, he's unclean. The priest shall pronounce him utterly unclean. His plague is in his head. And the leper in whom the plague is, his clothes shall be rent and his head bare, and he shall put a covering upon his upper lip and shall cry, unclean, unclean. All the days wherein the plague shall be in him, he shall be defiled. He is unclean. He shall dwell alone. Without the camp shall his habitation be. Let's stop there. We won't read too much more. Now, when we read in our text in Numbers 12, Miriam gets leprosy, white as snow. The very next phrase tells us that Aaron sees it, and behold, she was leprous. Once Aaron sees it and diagnoses it and is able to tell, yes, this is leprosy, Aaron has now the responsibility to start a cycle where he declares her to be unclean and initiate her isolation. She has to go. She has to be set aside. She has to be isolated, unclean, away. That's a big deal, right? Now, how many times has Aaron seen this before? Is this one of Aaron's first real issues dealing with this leprosy? As they murmur against Moses, and as God reacts in his anger, as his anger is kindled against, the cloud departs, she is struck with leprosy. And Aaron, he's not struck with leprosy, but he sees it and immediately is struck with the responsibility that this is my sister, but I have to declare her unclean, and I have to remove her from the congregation. I have to isolate her. She has to be alone. Keep that in mind now as verse 11. Verse number 11. And this is the third part of the chapter where it deals with intercession for Miriam. Verse number 11, it says, and Aaron said unto Moses, alas, my Lord, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly, and wherein we have sinned. Now, I want you to notice right away, Aaron immediately confesses. He does mark that they have done foolishly. Now, some people look at that, and a lot of commentators note that when he mentions them doing foolishly, Aaron's noting that what he was doing, what their murmuring was not a malicious attempt to have something happen to Moses. It's not that they were trying to remove Moses from authority as much as it was to reveal they felt hurt, they felt bitter, they felt slighted. But he confesses that we have done foolishly and we have sinned. This is a lot better than the last time, right? When Aaron was confronted with wrongdoing, with something that he had done wrong, and immediately he wanted to divert the blame, right? Immediately he wanted to say, oh, Moses, you know how these people are. Their heart is set on mischief. Or, I didn't really build the calf. Yeah, they gave me the gold and I put it in, but it wasn't really my fault. It just came out this way. Aaron has learned. Miriam is the one that was struck with leprosy. He could have immediately turned to Moses and said, yeah, well, she got what was coming to her. This was all her fault anyway. But he doesn't do that. He says, Moses, and he says, Moses, my Lord. He immediately takes a position that he knows he's responsible to take. If God has spoken to Aaron, and God has spoken to Aaron, okay? This is not an if, okay? Don't look at this passage as an if. God speaks to Aaron. Aaron is the high priest. God has spoken to Moses and Aaron in times past. But Moses is the leader of Israel. Moses is God's premier and primary prophet. And in humbleness and in confession, he says to Moses, "Alas, my Lord, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly and wherein we have sinned." No attempting to avert responsibility. He takes it. We were foolish and we sinned. And that confession is a lot better than the last one that we saw. Verse 12, "Let her not be as one dead, of whom the flesh is half consumed when he cometh out of his mother's womb." Aaron looks at this situation. He compares it to about as hopeless a situation as you can. The analogy in verse 12 is that of a stillborn child, one who has died in the womb, and yet the mother still has to go through the process of some kind of delivery. But when the child comes out at the end of verse 12, the child was dead. The flesh was consumed. It mentions, "Let her not be as one dead." He uses a hopeless analogy here. Moses, please don't let this happen. This is about as helpless and hopeless a situation as I can imagine. Aaron realizes he can't do anything, right? He doesn't have any control. There's nothing that he can do. This is a terrible and helpless situation. He realizes, Moses, you got to pray. Moses, you got to do something, Moses. We messed up. We were wrong. We have sinned. And we've brought a world of a mess upon us. It says in verse 13 that Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, "Heal her now, O God, I beseech thee." Moses prays. Now this is typical of Moses' character. Moses often prays. He often intercedes. He interceded for Israel. He interceded for his brother in the situation with the golden calf we talked about last week. We used, the Bible. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. The Bible uses the faithfulness of Moses as the analogy when speaking of the faithfulness of Christ. But it's interesting also when you talk about meekness. This passage calls Moses the meekest man who was on the face of the earth. There's a comparison here and an analogy about Christ and his meekness. Notice in 1 Peter chapter 2, 1 Peter 2 and verse 23, "Who, when he was reviled not again. When he was suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously." Christ, when he was reviled, didn't revile again. When he suffered, when he was threatened, when he was punched and whipped and beaten, he didn't retaliate in the same manner. Moses could have looked at this situation and thought, well, you know what? That's what you guys get for opening your big mouths. You guys didn't think. You jumped the gun. You made false accusations. You opened your mouth. He could have, what could he have said about this situation? You get what's coming to you. And yet he didn't do that. He's the meekest man upon the face of the earth. And though his own brother and sister maybe have spoken out against him, he's the first one immediately to rush to prayer and to rush to intercession. Aaron knows that, and that's why he pled with Moses. Aaron has seen this, and Aaron has learned this. And Moses says to the Lord, "God, I beseech thee, heal her now." Moses was not content to have Miriam taught a lesson, to just go on with the leprosy. He pleads for the Lord to heal her. That's typical of Moses' character. And it was great now. Okay, we're a little bit of time removed from Exodus chapter 32, but Aaron is now evidencing that he understands confession and intercession. Verse 14, it says that the Lord has said unto Moses, "If her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed 7 days? Let her be shut out from the camp 7 days, and after that let her be received in again." Now, God is going to heal Miriam. He's going to take away her leprosy. For a time being, she still needs to bear the shame of that. This was a big deal. This was not a light situation. And Moses has interceded. Moses has found a way to have Miriam spared. She's going to be spared the longevity of humiliation that goes with leprosy, the longevity of being unclean and isolation. All those things are going to be resolved, and all those things are going to be restored. But the Lord does allow her for 7 days as a testimony to kind of bear the shame of this. Listen, the Lord he gives an analogy here. If her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed 7 days? If a daughter had, shamed her father, he would evidence it in a certain way, and that would be a shame unto her. And so the Lord says that's what's going to happen here. She's spoken out against Moses, and in turn spoken out against the Lord and his order of things. For 7 days, she'll bear the shame of the leper, and she'll bear the shame of the isolation and whatnot, but then she can be received in again. I don't know what was said, and I don't know, and I've read several things this week, and no one seems to have a clear understanding. It really is all just speculation. What led up to this event? But Miriam and Aaron have, whatever they said, whatever was ever in their heart, or what was ever said in bitterness, was apparently a big deal. And they challenged Moses, and Moses let it roll right off, right? Moses didn't think much of it. Moses, he's the meekest man that ever lived. He didn't take it to heart. But the Lord heard it, it said, and it was a big deal to him. This could have been a lot worse for Miriam. This could have been a lot worse. If she had to bear the shame of that leprosy for any length of time at all, that would have been humiliating to her. It would have been humiliating to their family. God spared them that. And Aaron, again, gets to see what intercession is all about. What it means to go and stand between someone and plead for their healing, to plead for their cleansing. And that's going to become important because in just a couple of chapters, when folks start to turn against Aaron, and he's going to be confronted with the same thing that Moses is confronted with. What do I do when the people turn against me? What do I do when people slight and say things evil toward me and about me? How will Aaron respond? The leadership of Moses and the intercession that Moses shows is a great teaching tool and a lesson for Aaron that we'll be able to see him apply next time. Father, we're grateful to come today. We're thankful for our class.